Hello, I'm so glad you're here. This is Jennifer, and today I have a technique that works really well with pretty much any background dye, but you can actually do this technique with other dyes too. And all you need in addition to the dye is a simple tool that I bet most of you have in your house. As always, I have several examples for you because I feel the best way to really learn a technique and all you can do with it is lots of examples. All right, let's get started with this one first. For this, I am starting with a piece of plain white cardstock. I am placing it onto an Altenew Ultra Sticky Matte. Now this is just a matte that's kind of like the material a clear stamp is made from, and it'll hold my paper in place and keep it from moving around as I do ink blending. Any sticky matte will work, or you could just skip that and go right onto your work surface. Now over this background, I am doing ink blending of some dark colors of Pinkfresh Dye Ink. I'm starting in the middle and using a large blending brush. Because I want to cover this entire background with color, the bigger blending brush is easier and faster. Now you will notice I am not doing an excellent job blending these colors together. I am just trying to put down a good amount of color and overlap them so that you get the blend from one color to the next, but it's not going to be perfect. I am here to let you know you do not need to spend a lot of time with blending. It will always dry nice, and once you put other things on it, no one will tell if your blending isn't great. So you can see mine's pretty splotchy, but this will work great for this technique. I will be using this new fabulous dye from Pinkfresh called Snowflake Coverplate. It does cut a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch edge, and the dye also does little die cut holes and a pierced pattern. So this is what it looks like when you just cut it regular like you would with any dye from white cardstock. I love the detail. But today we're going to make an impression with this dye and then step it up a little bit. So to make an impression with the dye, you need to set up your die cut machine to do so. I think all die cut machines come with a flexible mat. You can see here the one with the Spellbinders Platinum is gray. That flexible mat allows you to make an impression with the dye instead of cutting with it. So there's the mat there. I'm just following the instructions that my Spellbinders Platinum comes with to make an impression with the dye or dry emboss with the dye. For this particular technique, I'm putting my inked cardstock piece face down onto that flexible mat, then the dye up against the back of that cardstock piece. I'll run it through my die cut machine, and this will make an impression on the back of the cardstock so that everything on the colored side, the front, is raised. So we're doing it backwards, but that's what works for the technique that we're doing today. Here you can see what both sides look like. I promise the color side will look even better in a moment. But quickly, I just wanted to show you what the die, this is the die cut if you use the die as intended to cut your cardstock. Here's what it looks like if you use it to make an impression. So 2 different looks from one background die, and you can do this with almost any background or piercing cover plate die. I have more examples I'll show you later. All right, so back to this project. We have the raised area with the color on it. We're going to use a sanding block or sandpaper to lightly sand on this colored side. Now what will happen here is, remember that snowflake pattern is raised on this side. So when we apply the sanding over this, it will remove the ink from those raised areas. That ink we put down just kind of sits on top of the paper. It really only dyes the top level of the paper. So when we sand that off, we expose the white core of the cardstock. And this really brings out that pattern, giving us a unique look, something completely different than if you use the dye as it's normally intended. So here's a closer look. Look at that beautiful bold color with that white raised pattern showing. I just love this result. Again, we'll have more examples, but let's get started with this one and turn it into a card. Now to decorate this, I am using the Pinkfresh Large Snowflake die set. This is a great die set that creates 3 large snowflakes that can be used together or separately. I am layering them together. I cut each from vellum, and I'm gluing them together with just a dot of liquid adhesive at the center. And you can see how I've created this really fun layered vellum snowflake. Now the background I did trim down to be 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm gluing it onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. I did feel that my vellum snowflake got lost a little bit on the background, so I die cut the largest snowflake die from white cardstock, and I'm putting that behind our vellum snowflake. I also thought I'd give my vellum snowflake a little bit of a haircut. So these longest little pieces that stick out on the sides, I'm just cutting a little bit off of that. And this is a good reminder that you can always give your die cuts haircuts so that they could get a different look. So this kind of simplifies that vellum snowflake, and we'll glue that on top of the white cardstock snowflake. I could have left it as is, but I felt that this really brought this whole snowflake to life. So there we can see what it looks like now. And it looks like the large vellum snowflake is different from that white snowflake because I gave it a haircut, but it's really the same die. For my sentiment, I'm using the Pinkfresh Basic Banners. Now this is a large die that cuts a bunch of banner shapes. You can see it in my hand there. They have 3 stamp sets now that coordinate with this die. On here we have the celebration one and the Christmas one. There's also an everyday one. I'm using the Christmas one today. It's a large stamp with all these sentiments, and you stamp them all at once. If you want to, you could cut these out by hand, but I'm going to use that coordinating die. And that one coordinating die goes with all 3 of the stamp sets, which is nice so you can get more use from it. So I'm lining up this die with the stamped images, running that through my die cut machine, and now I quickly have all of these sentiments cut. And what's fun about this particular die is it has lots of different shapes. So not every banner will look the same. The variety is always good and is really good for making sure you use it more often. So I'm going through these different options here, and I decided to use the Christmas Hugs and Love. I really liked that sentiment. Now the die cut this Christmas Love and Hugs to have a little V cut, that little banner cut on the right-hand side, but it's cut straight on the left. You can see it there. I wanted it to have that little V on the left-hand side too. So I thought I'd do a little trick here and share it with you. I'm putting the die cut back into the die so that we have that little V cut on the die on the left-hand side of the strip. I'll run that through my die cut machine, and that will give that little V cut on both sides of the sentiment strip. You definitely could cut that by hand if you prefer too. I'm putting the card together now using strong liquid adhesive. This is Gina K Connect, and I'm gluing the snowflake towards the top center of our background. Now I want to add that sentiment strip that we just created on top of that, but I wanted some dimension to it. So I have these cardstock scraps. These are just scraps I have collected in my drawer, and I'm gluing a couple of them on the back of our sentiment strip. This will give it some dimension and strength so it doesn't get crushed in the mail as it's sitting on top of the snowflake. This is a nice alternative to using foam tape. It's more economical. You're using up scraps that would probably go in the trash anyway, and it'll look nice in the end. To finish it off, I am adding little gemstones to the ends of these little vellum snowflakes. So this is actually helping to hold those little snowflake ends down. I put a drop of glue behind the vellum snowflake tip, then a drop on top, and then I put a gem in place. There are adhesives out there that work with vellum, but I don't trust any of them. I feel like the best thing to do is to hide your adhesive behind something else. In this case, behind these little gemstones. So here's a look at the completed card. I did add a few more gemstones to that vellum snowflake because I love to add all those details. And here's a closer look at that background. You can see that blending that we did looks good in the end, even though I didn't take much effort to get a smooth blend. And you can see how the raised area is white because we sanded off the top layer of that cardstock. And I'll talk more about that technique as we go. Here on the snowflake with this close-up look, you can see how we really added a lot of interest to that snowflake by layering the white cardstock and vellum together and then adding the little gemstones. All right, so let's move on to another example using this technique of using background dyes to make an impression and then sand it to expose that pattern. Now this time I'll use a different type of background dye, and I'm going to apply my ink differently. In the last example, I did ink blending on white cardstock. This time I'm going to use a gel press. This is just another way to apply ink onto a background. I have a 12 by 12 gel press here. It's really big. You don't really need one this big. I bought this one and hadn't used it, so I thought I'd pull it out today. Any gel press would work. I'm actually putting a piece of white cardstock behind it. This is the size of my note card, and that way I can kind of see where I'm applying my ink. I only need this small area, not that entire gel press. I have a Holtz Brayer here, which is my favorite type of brayer to use. I'm rolling the brayer onto my Pinkfresh Dye Ink and then rolling it onto the gel press right above that white cardstock piece. Then I'll take another piece of white cardstock and press onto that, lifting the color that I applied onto the gel press. I will do this a few times, each time applying the ink with the brayer in different directions, but only towards that top area. So I'm building up color and I want it to look like it's kind of layered up, this kind of artsy look. I don't want something super blended. I want kind of that uneven look of color. If you want this to be darker, you could use a darker color of ink or build up more layers. I'm using softer colors and then building it up a few times. Now for the middle area here, I'm doing the Candy Violet. You can see I just quickly apply it onto the gel press, press my cardstock onto it, and then do this a few times. And you can see how we're creating this really fun, unique background. If you want something smooth, there are ways to do smooth backgrounds with the gel press. I will link to a video where I show more about this type of technique up here on the top right and in my description below. I just wanted to show you there are many ways you can apply ink onto white cardstock to do today's technique. Last example was with ink blending and using a blending brush. Here I'm just using dye ink, a brayer, and a gel press. So many different things that you can do. All right, so now I really like the look of this. I like this kind of artsy look that we have. There's a closer look at that color that has been built up on the white background. The background dye I chose to use for the technique on this card is the Pinkfresh Studio Secret Garden Dye. Now this cuts a frame that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches with all of that intricate die cutting. It's a beautiful die cut. We'll see it later on used as normal. But here we're going to use that background dye to make an impression on the back of my cardstock. Again, the reason I'm doing the impression on the back is that way when we flip it over to the inked side, the die cut impression will be raised and we'll be able to sand it off. So after running that through our die cut machine, just following the instructions to make an impression or emboss with the die, here's the result that we have. Now I'll take my sanding block and gently sand over the raised image. Now I do recommend going back and forth and in circles in different directions to get the best results. This is a white sanding block, I believe from Paper Artsy. There's a few that come in a pack. Highly recommend those. I use these a lot in crafting, and I'll talk about other things you can do with these sanding blocks later in this video. However, if you don't have a sanding block, just grab a piece of sandpaper. The lighter sandpaper usually works better, but use what you have and just be gentle to start. Another option is the distress sanding discs that are available for the ink blending tools from Tim Holtz. You just pop one on there instead of foam or felt, and then you can just carefully sand over the raised area. That is another tool that works well for this. Now you'll notice there is a place I sanded too much where some white is showing there. That's okay, I'll just cut that off, but that's a good reminder to go gently and take your time sanding off the raised surface. Usually I don't sand too much, as you see I did there, so it's not usually a problem. Just go light and build up the pressure. And I really like how you get this kind of outline image look using a regular die. All right, so now to cut this out, I'm using the Pinkfresh Nested Arches dies. Now there is a nested arch die set and there's a hot foil plate set that goes along with it. You can see it up there on the top right, but I'm only using the dies today. I have used these in a previous video and I'll link to it up at the top right if you want to check that out. Now this is a die cut created with that same Secret Garden background die, but just cut normally, and you can see how intricate it is. I cut 2 from white cardstock and glued them together using a spray adhesive. And then I glued those stacked die cuts onto a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, just for a little interest on the background of our card. On the back of our inked and textured arch die cut, I did glue 2 additional white arch die cuts, just for some dimension as we glue this onto our card. I like that we have that floral die cut on the background and the same one used to make the impression on the pink arch piece. Now for sentiment, I'm using the Pinkfresh All Kinds of Wonderful stamp set. Now this is a stamp set that has coordinating stencils and dies available. I am just using the sentiment from this and the coordinating die. I really like that the coordinating die cuts out the words really closely, so it doesn't cover up much of your background when you add it to your card. I really like the sentiment. So I stamped it with black on white cardstock and used that die to cut it out. And then I die cut 2 additional die cuts to glue behind that, again, for dimension and strength. For accents on my cards, I'm using the Pinkfresh Studio Fall Leaf Die. Now I'm cutting one from glitter cardstock, and then I'm going to create some leaf die cuts using vellum. However, one layer of vellum didn't really show up on my background, so I wanted to do a double layer of vellum with some adhesive between. What I like to do is take an Altenew adhesive sheet and press it onto vellum, then add another piece of vellum on top of that. So here I have a full sheet that I'll just fold over onto that adhesive sheet. So this will be 2 layers of vellum with adhesive between, and I can cut the excess off and use it on something else. Now I'll die cut that double layer of vellum from the leaf die, and this will give me a less see-through vellum die cut, and it'll show up more on my card. So I die cut a couple from that double layer of vellum and one from Altenew Diamond Glitter cardstock, and I'm gluing those together onto my card. Because the glitter leaf will stand out more, I'm gluing that one down with liquid adhesive. Then I will take the double layered vellum die cuts and cut that into smaller pieces and tuck it behind the glitter die cut. That way I don't have to worry about the adhesive showing through, and really the glitter die cut will hold the vellum one down. Once I get it in place behind the glitter die cut, I'll put a little more liquid adhesive to make sure it stays put. And I'll put a few more of the vellum die cut pieces peeking out from the glitter die cut piece in different areas. Now I can add my sentiment. I really like that the die cuts this sentiment out close, so you can see how it doesn't cover up too much, yet it's a nice large size sentiment. All right, so here is a look at the completed card. I did add some little glitter gemstones here and there just to add a little bit more sparkle. Looking closely, you can see that fun technique that we did on the pink arch piece and how that pattern ties in with the die cut that we used on the note card background. Lots of layers and lots of texture on this one, but sometimes I think that's really fun to create. Okay, on the last example, we used a regular background die. This time, I'm going to use a piercing background die. I'll show you more on that in a moment. But first, let's create our inked background. I'm once again starting with white cardstock, and I'll use my brayer to apply ink on this background. I again wanted kind of that artsy look, so I'm doing a little bit of a different technique than the last one. In this case, I have my cardstock laying on my gel press. I'm picking up ink from my ink pad using the brayer and rolling it onto the gel press just to kind of soften the amount of ink on the brayer before I bring it to the paper. Then I'm just building up color in different directions onto our white cardstock. Now you could go direct from the ink pad with the brayer to your paper, but I like to roll that ink onto my gel press first to kind of smooth out the ink a little bit so you don't get as much of a splotchy look, but more this kind of buildup of color. It's hard to explain, but really fun and easy to do. I've been having shoulder problems, so doing a lot of ink blending can be tough on me. So using a brayer like this, I find is much easier. However, use whatever technique you want to apply color onto your white cardstock. You don't want to go direct to paper with the ink pad though, because you don't want to put down so much ink that it soaks all the way through your white cardstock, making it hard to sand that color off. So using a brayer, a gel press, or blending brush is really a great way to go. Now this time I'm using a piercing die or a piercing cover plate. This doesn't actually cut anything. It just does this piercing pattern on your cardstock. And these type of dies work great for this technique also. Once again, I'm putting my cardstock upside down onto that flexible embossing mat, then the die on top of that, and run it through my die cut machine. So we're making an impression on the back of our cardstock, you can see it there, so that we have that raised pattern on the front where the ink is. Now it's time to do our sanding. This time I'm using the Tim Holtz sanding discs on an ink blending tool. With this, it has a little more sanding power to it. The grit is a little bit more intense. So I recommend going very light-handed and then kind of build up as you go. That will work really no matter what type of sandpaper you may have. Now this tool I really think is helpful when you have maybe areas you want to sand but not the whole thing, or different areas that you need to get that sanding paper into better. So I really do like using this tool in addition to the sanding block, which I'll again talk about more later. So after I sanded all of the raised area to remove that color, I trimmed my background down to 4 by 5¼ inches. I'm using those large snowflake dies that I showed you at the beginning of this video. I used the smallest of the 3 snowflakes and cut it several times from vellum. And I'm gluing those snowflakes just with a little drop of glue in the center into the pattern on our background, covering the entire background. I'm not sure why, but I'm using a lot of vellum today. I think sometimes I forget that it's a great accent to add a little interest but not be too distracting. Now for a sentiment on this one, I used a great new holiday sentiment stamp set from Pinkfresh Studio. This has lots of great sentiments and there are coordinating dies that cut them out close and nice. However, today I chose to just cut it with a rectangle instead, but do know there are coordinating dies available if you prefer. So I stamped that good tidings of joy or of comfort and joy with black ink on white cardstock and I trimmed it down. I added our background onto a 4¼ by 5½ inch white note card and added some silver glitter drops to the center of each of our snowflakes and the pattern in the background. So looking closely, you can see those little white dots in that kind of starburst pattern, thanks to the technique that we did today. We have the blue and ink colors and those gentle vellum snowflakes with lots of sparkle at the center. So this card shows you this technique works really well with piercing or faux stitching coverplate dies also. Okay, I have 2 more examples for you. Both are variations of this technique. On this first one, instead of starting with white cardstock, we're starting with colored cardstock for a more subtle background. So I have a piece of pink cardstock here. You want something kind of light. I've got a light pink cardstock here. And I am just applying bubblegum ink, which is a slightly darker pink ink, on top of it. Now I'm again not taking much effort to get a great blend, and I don't even put ink at the center of it because that'll be covered anyways. But I'm putting a pretty light layer of this bubblegum pink ink onto the light pink background cardstock. If you want to, you can go for more high contrast. I wanted something subtle this time. I'm again using a piercing cover plate. This is the Pinkfresh Dotted Chevron cover plate die. Again, this doesn't cut anything. It just does a faux piercing pattern. These are really fun to use on the front of a note card, by the way. So I'm taking our inked cardstock piece and putting the die on the back side of it so that we're making an impression on the back side. We'll run this through our die cut machine as we've done many times to dry emboss or make an impression with a die. Now on our ink side, we have raised dots. So I have my sanding block here and I'll gently sand over the raised dots. Now the sanding block, I have used these sanding blocks a billion times in videos. I find them very handy for techniques like this, but also if you get a little fingerprint somewhere of ink that you don't want, you can often sand that color away with the sanding block. So it's great for mistakes too. Very inexpensive tool. There's several in a package. Highly recommend. Since we started with light pink paper this time, when we sand off that darker pink ink, we expose the light pink dots. So this is a fun alternative to having the white show through. You can have a color show through. Next, I'll be using the Pinkfresh Studio Rosettes layering stencils and coordinating die. I really love this combo. So first, let's do the stenciling. I've put the first stencil over a piece of white cardstock. That big strip that you see there is blank stencil material that I just used to mask off different areas of the stencil. These stencils create 3 rosettes, and I want to do each one a different color. I'll link to the blank stencil material that I used to create this long strip here in my description below, but you could just use some scrap paper if you prefer. So I did the first rosette with a coral color. Now I'm doing yellow for the second one and pink for the third one. I'm using a large blending brush, but use whatever you have. Now this does have these little centers that you can create for each of the rosettes. I ended up not using these, but you'll see me ink them up as we go. All right, now for the second one, watch this. It lines up beautifully to create another layer or part of each of these rosettes. This time I'm using the same colors, but I'll either go lighter or darker. So each of these rosettes will be two-tone, and we'll have a coral, yellow, and pink. Now you could make a bunch of these at once using all the same color over the whole stencil if you wanted to. These would be great for birthday celebrations, New Year's. You could even do soft colors for a wedding card, baby card. Today I'm doing bright colors for a birthday card. Okay, so now that I've done two-tone of colors over these rosettes, look at that fun result. Now the cool part is the coordinating die not only cuts these out, but also adds a piercing detail to them. Now these coordinating dies could be used on their own and just cut from regular colored cardstock, or be used with the stenciled images that I just created. But in all, once you cut this out, look at the fun detail you get. I just think this is a great way to create really fun accents for a celebration card. Okay, let's put this card together. I trimmed my pink background down and added it to a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I used the Spellbinders Stylish Oval die set to die cut a white oval that I glued to the background, and now I'm adding my rosettes on top of that. For a sentiment, I used the Pinkfresh Studio Wonderful Sentiment stamp set and coordinating dies. And by the way, there is a hot foil plate sentiment set available also. So all 3 of these work well together. You can use them together or separately, which I really appreciate. I stamped Let's Celebrate with black and onto white cardstock and used the coordinating die to cut it out. And now I'm using little pieces of foam squares, kind of building up the layers so I can add this on top of our rosettes. By the way, I used Altenew diamond glitter cardstock to die cut a bunch of small circles. And I put some at the center of those rosettes and some as accents on the background. I think sometimes we often overlook those tiny little circle dies. They're great for creating your own accents if you don't have just the right color of rhinestones or pearls. All right, here's a look at the completed card. Check out that background. Remember, we have that pink tone-on-tone look with a little bit of texture, where the background is a darker pink and those raised dots are a lighter pink because of that sanding technique. We also have the detail in those rosettes, thanks to the layering stencils and those coordinating dies. And also our little glitter cardstock circles that we created as accents. Okay, I have one more card for you. This technique is a little bit different, but it's a variation of the one I'm sharing today, and I thought it'd be good to include. I will again be using that Snowflake background die that I used on our first example. But first, let's create the focal points for this card. I'm using the new Pinkfresh Floral Bauble stamp set, coordinating stencils, and coordinating dies. These are all sold separately, so you can use them together or separately. Now, I really like these because this allows you to stamp all of these images at once, stencil all of the images at once, and then die cut them all at once, which is a big time saver. So I've already stamped the images with black ink on white cardstock. Now I'm using the layering stencils to add color to these stamped images. You could skip the stamping if you want to not have that outline edge, but today I thought I'd go with it. Now, I'll be honest, as I'm using each of these stencils, I'm not really sure what color I want everything to be. I knew I wanted the leaves to be green, so I started by inking those first. I'm not necessarily following the numbers that each stencil has in the corner. I'm just going with what I'm certain of first, and that is green for the little leaves. I then moved on to blues for the bow, and then some reds or some kind of coral colors for the flowers. And by the way, as I am inking on this white cardstock piece, you'll notice I have my Altenew grip mat in the background that's holding my paper and my stencil in place as I ink over it. There are lots of different sticky mats out there. I've used a variety of them in videos, and I try to switch it up in each video just so you know there are lots of good options for you. If you don't have a sticky mat, you could just tape the stencil onto the cardstock so that it doesn't shift. All right, so I did some basic inking over this, nothing fancy. I just used greens, corals, and blues. And now I'm using the large coordinating die that will cut all of these pieces out at once. And you'll end up with that little floral ball shape. You'll end up with a bow that could be used for lots of different things. And these two little berry sprigs that I'm actually not going to use today, but I'll save for another project. Now it's time for that background, which is a variation of today's technique. This time I'm just starting with plain white cardstock, and I'm using that same Snowflake die that I used at the beginning of this video. I gave a little mist to my white cardstock first, then I'll lay the die on top, and I do again have my die cut machine set up to do dry embossing or to make an impression with the die. So this is all on top of that flexible gray mat. I ran that through my die cut machine as we've done many times in this video, and you'll see that you get a beautiful impression on both sides of the white cardstock. You could use either side. Now this time I'm using a brayer and a light color of ink to roll over the raised area. So this will give me a white background, but then soft color on the raised areas, which is reverse from what we did earlier. Earlier, we ended up with white on the raised areas with bold color around it because we did that sanding technique. This time, I'm just using a brayer to apply that soft ink on the raised areas. You could also go direct to paper very lightly by dragging your ink pad over the raised areas. Now, this technique variation can be done with any background die also. All right, so I trimmed that down and added it to a pool note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And onto it, I am adding our bow, our little floral piece here, and I did put additional die cuts behind each of those, so there's a little bit of dimension to them. I'm using liquid adhesive on the back to make sure that it does adhere nicely to that textured background. Here I'm using some darker marker just to add a little bit of darkness into the nooks and crannies of our stamped image. Sometimes that just really helps to make it pop. And I used a Happy Holiday sentiment from the same Basic Banners Christmas stamp set that I showed you earlier. This time I trimmed the Happy Holidays very closely, just using a paper trimmer. I did finish off the card by adding some ruby glitter drops around the flowers just so there would be a little bit of sparkle. And then in the background, we have that soft texture and soft color that we created using a variation of today's technique. Now, one important thing I wanted to mention is I used all background dies for today's technique, but you can do this with other dies, shape dies. And if you want to, I can do a video with some ideas for that. Just leave me a comment if you think that would be something good to share. All right, if you have any questions about the products I used today, I have them linked in my YouTube description below. And at the end, I will share a couple other videos that are variations of this technique. I hope you'll check them out. I appreciate this time that you spent with me. I hope you'll try this idea out, and I'll see you again soon with another video.